Scale of 1 to 10. And by the way, I'm sitting there in the dentist's waiting room. There's a poster on the wall of a cartoon tooth. And the tooth had a face, and the tooth was smiling, and the tooth had teeth. What's up, you have a horror film? There were kids in there.
James Acaster is an absurd comedian whose persona mashes together the swagger and arrogance of a confident man with the awkwardness and social incompetence of a badly programmed robot. He graces the stage with sickeningly unfashionable mustard jumpers or terrible ties.
Paisley makes the girls go crazily.
He speaks with a bizarre croaking voice that uses strange inflections at odd times. He's by no means the only comedian to have an uncool, out-of-touch persona, but he's one of the few who plays the persona of a terribly uncool man who brags and boasts and says everything with such jarring conviction as though he thought he was the coolest person to ever exist.
I wouldn't have had you down as such a big Beyonce fan.
Oh, well, I didn't have you down. That's such an ignorant host.
Mainly though, James Acaster is baffling in all senses of the word. In his style, his jokes, his weird imagery and narratives he uses, his delivery.
Everyone's trapped in the conga. Well, what, you think you can leave? You can't leave. Person at the back, maybe. They can let go, make them run for it. Everyone else you let go. You're not out the conga. Now, you're the leader of a rival conga. Now you've got turf wars to worry about.
Everything about his approach is deliberately baffling, and that's what I want to talk about today, and it's a large part of why he's my favourite comedian.
Do the tooth teeth have teeth too? Do the tooth teeth have teeth too?
I first discovered him from his classic scrapes on Josh Widdicombe's podcast, most of which you can now find on YouTube, but he's known for Would I Lie to You, Mock the Week, and his charity appearance on the Great British Bake Off. However, I'm going to focus on his successful 4-part Netflix stand-up show called Repetoire, because that's where we see his stand-up in its truest sense, and because his later show, Cold Lasagna Hate Myself 1999, while I saw it live, I don't think any of the footage is out for it yet.
Favourite number? Umpteen? It's a curious number, but it sounds big, but it's in the teens. Someone's cooking the books.
And a lot of people might not find James Acaster funny. That's fair enough. His bizarre swagger might annoy you. But I think it's hard to argue he isn't one of the most creative, original, imaginative comedians going at the moment. And that's partly due to his absurdity. You see, the typical ordinary stand-up comedians endeavour in their shows to make themselves relatable. We're aware, of course, they bend the truth in their stories, but they tend to frame it in such a way that you suspend your disbelief and kind of take the events as true. But not just that, the experiences they detail, the situations, they're meant to feel real and we're meant to empathise and understand them, because the more we relate, the more we obviously like the comedian, it creates a sense of connection, and the more we like them, the more open we are to laugh.
It's funny because it's true.
James Acaster, however, endeavours to achieve the opposite. His stories are deliberately unbelievable and absurd, to such an extent he appears like an alien life form we're looking in on. Someone from an entirely different world who's speaking perfect English but just catches us out with an odd frame of reference. His first show in Repetoire centres around the story of James actually being an undercover cop who's really called Pat Springleaf that became a comedian solely to infiltrate a gang of drug-dealing stand-up comedians.
10 years ago, I had to infiltrate a gang dealing drugs to comedians backstage at comedy gigs. Naturally, I assumed the identity of a stand-up comedian to get close to the gang. 10 years down the line, still haven't closed the case, but the gigs keep rolling in. Good to be here.
That's not just a throwaway joke, it's the story the entire show revolves around. This long, ridiculous narrative about how the case took over his life and destroyed his marriage, like he's some awkward British version of Donnie Brasco. And there's also absurdity in the barrage of small moments designed entirely to perplex. He begins the first show kneeling down, and it's not until much later he explains why he's kneeling, nor even until 15 minutes into the show that he actually does stand up. The second show begins in the dark with a long existential questioning on life that seems to derail and run off into a tangent.
But what came before that?
The third show begins with music and applause, only for them to be cut deliberately short, and the fourth begins with him already halfway through a rambling monologue before he even appears.
I mean, you want to be as productive as you can be on any given day, obviously anyone does, but it's hard not to beat yourself up, you know?
It's perplexing, as is the structure for a lot of his jokes. Rather than the typical thing of getting us on his side, getting us to understand the situation, to relate to it, and then only then to start exaggerating and building it up for comic effect, James does the opposite and throws something incomprehensible at you, which you struggle to grasp. And then the comedy comes a moment later when he explains this incomprehensible thing, relieving our sense of confusion and having us laugh at just how bizarre the experience was. And there are so many unexpected moments the shows descend into, such as an out-of-the-blue interpretive dance where only after does he tell us.
That's a part of the show entitled The Do's and Don'ts of Passport Photography.
We get that, we get extracts from a fictional podcast with other drug dealer comedians. We have long sections of him failing to smash things in anger. We see him eating a Christingle in the dark, sing a bizarre football chant about Kettering Town FC for an uncomfortably long amount of time, or try under pressure to play Auld Lang Syne on whatever this thing is. The whole thing just knocks you off balance. Even the more ordinary observational comedy sides, they get wrapped into these bizarre narratives that just knock you off balance. For example, these things. James makes an ordinary observational comedy joke about how nobody knows what the official name for them is. He calls them...
Picture should put your head in. They're the opposite of masks. Does that help anyone at all? They're the opposite of masks.
But nobody knows the official name, and he suggests there isn't one at all. And it's a weirdly specific piece of observational comedy that, say, 20 years ago would have begun with a comedian asking, "What's the deal with those photo cutouts you get at the beaches? Nobody seems to know what the real name for them is. What's up with that?" type thing. James, however, comes to this piece of observational comedy simply as part of a weirdly emotional anecdote about the undercover cop Pat Springleaf and how he tried going to the beach to cheer himself up after his wife left him, and then finding one of these pictures you put your head in where there's a head for a policeman and one for a robber, and he's so deep into his case that he then has an identity crisis because he can't tell if he's a criminal or a cop anymore.
The cop and the robber? I know where to put my head. I've been undercover so long. Don't know who I am anymore.
All of which concludes with the chilling question,
What if every relationship you've ever been in is just somebody slowly figuring out they didn't like you as much as they hoped they would?
And in a way I think that example sums up the true genius of his absurdity. Because it's incredibly difficult for a comedian to be truly absurd, because you have to be so creative and imaginative with it. It's like when people try to be random or try to say something random, and most people will just say stuff like toast or cheese. Cheese is the typical word a lot of people use. Or objects of food. You know, honestly, I can remember doing an exercise at uni once, I can't remember why, where we all had to go around and say something random, and a lot of people did say just items of food, because it seemed random to them, but it's actually quite uncreative, where something more absurd that would throw you off guard is like saying the inside of a snare drum, or jealous butterflies. Whatever. The point is, it's difficult, which is why James Acaster needs the imagination to draw on not just so many different stories, but different elements to his stand-up shows. You know, not just saying odd things, but the kneeling down, or doing an interpretive dance out of the blue, or whatever else. And even then, that's not the true genius of his absurdity. I got sidetracked there. The true genius is how meaningful all the absurdity actually is. Like this picture you put your head in story that leads to this question of identity and his wife leaving him. All his strange jokes, all his baffling narratives actually lead somewhere. And as the shows come towards their conclusion, all these drastically differing and abstract things he's talked about somehow tie in together and weave to form this genuinely emotional and meaningful ending. that's what makes it so clever, because then you don't feel like the whimsy and absurdity was just a trick. It's not just someone saying odd things to confuse you, there's actually a point to it. It's like a magician's reveal in that sense. That's what really makes it so delightful. Not just the moment of feeling perplexed and the relief of later understanding, but the delight at the genuine meaning within all the bafflement. Show 1 is an emotional story of a breakup and an identity crisis. Show 2 is a story about growing up as a little Christian boy and being given this clear, comforting understanding of right and wrong, only to grow up and question everything and spin out into a frightening crisis. Show 3 is about yearning for a restart in our lives when we feel lost and regret the path we've taken and our anger at the world around us, and then Show 4 ties all of them together. And not only that, but there's this story running throughout all 4 parts of this criminal James Acaster who broke the law but snitched on his friends and then had to go into the witness protection program, where he then got promoted to an undercover cop and only then ended up a comedian out of that. Show 3 and 4 come chronologically before 1 and 2 and kind of provide the backstory to a lot of the narrative he set up there, such as this breakup he talks about in Show 1. In Show 4 he's only just become an undercover cop and he's still happily married, and he talks about meeting this girl and how positive he feels about things with her, where Show 1 is then talking about how he broke up with her, which I guess gives it all this sort of Christopher Nolan style time-bending narrative feel, where Show 4 ends with him walking off stage and then coming back on the other side at the beginning where Show 1 started. So that's the genius. How all this absurdity actually manages to tell a coherent, meaningful story. I find that really refreshing and really fun. And not just that, I think if I'm allowed to get overly pretentious and analyse stuff that isn't meant to be analysed, because that's what I do, I'm sorry. If I'm allowed to do that, I'd say there's a nice message in all of this. You know, it's typical human nature that we're afraid of the unknown, particularly if you're an American soldier in any sci-fi or alien film ever made, where, you know, they always just shoot at the strange things they don't understand. James Acaster is a strange thing we don't quite understand, and it's delightful. We aren't scared by him, we don't shoot at him. He teaches us to be intrigued rather than afraid of the incomprehensible. He teaches us to be fascinated by the unknown rather than clinging to the edges of everything that's clear and neatly defined. Because we love order as humans. We love to be in total control of our own lives and universe, because the uncertainty and unpredictable existence scares us. We're terrified of the confusion. James Acaster, however, reminds us that being confused can be fun, that whimsy and nonsense are fun and exciting, and that we don't have to be afraid of the things we don't understand. Or more so, we shouldn't be afraid, because it's in grappling with the unknown that we learn new things and grow, and we gradually discover what at first seemed absurd and incomprehensible actually carries a lot of meaning and emotional weight. And that, as a point, I think sums up James Acaster's style of comedy. I doubt that was the intention behind it, but it's still an interesting one to spot, and another good reason for why I love him so much.
He works in a casino, and one day he was, is dice plural and dice singular? It was die plural. Anyway, he killed 2 people by mistake.
Let me know your thoughts though, good or bad. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you fancy more, and support me on Patreon if you fancy even more. But otherwise, hopefully see you next time.